Hello. Today I'd like to look into a topic that is probably the most important topic I think that could ever be addressed by us human beings, and that is what makes us happy, or what do we most want? And most would say it's happiness. And underneath would next pop up, I guess, the topic of fears, because many, if you stop to think of it, would say what makes them most unhappy is a lot of fear in their lives, over a variety of things, of course. Now, this might be a topic first addressed way back in time, but Freud also attempted to address it with his own perspective when he came up with the pleasure principle paper of his. And I think he basically said that we humans try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, as though it's a 50-50 deal. Try to do both at the same time. But a few years ago I ran into someone with some YouTube podcasts and a book out that caused me to think in new terms. This man, Noah Elkreef, stated basically that in his opinion what we most want as human beings is serenity. And I suppose you might say he's looking more from a Buddhist perspective or a meditative perspective. And that really shifted my thinking, because in my mind today, I'd say serenity has a lot more to do with getting rid of negative emotions than increasing positive ones. For if you think of it, when we're happy, we don't have to be using cocaine to achieve that happiness, hopefully. That happiness is more the absence of pain than it is an extreme high, such that you might even argue that boredom is painful, not because you're not being stimulated greatly by something or another, but because boredom is the absence of activity that distracts you from painful thoughts. And so even here, getting back to the topic of pain, much more than elevation of mood or euphoria that Freud might have been hinting at, such as when he posited so much on the topic of sex and how you might get euphoria from that. But Noah Elkreef, on the other hand, is pointing out that what makes us most happy, in his opinion, is kind of a steady state of serenity, where, in my opinion, that mostly consists of absence of negative emotions, such as fear and anger, basically. So today, instead of taking a look at both of these topics of fear and anger as probably the two big distressing emotions we can have, I'd like to focus in on fear. And so here we go. I'd say, first of all, that if we want to be more serene and happy in life, let's take a look at babies and what makes them serene, if you want to think of it, to the point where after a certain point a baby will be so content that it might just fall asleep. So what would make a baby serene or happy or content? I'd say, as I look at it, that the baby's needs are met, the basic physiological needs. And here I would kind of tend toward looking at things like food and, of course, air. That's a given. Proper temperature, not too hot, not too cold. Enough sleep, and not too much chaos, such that a baby, of course, doesn't like to be startled, nor does it like loud noises. So again, chaos being key too. And also part and parcel of chaos being changes made in a slow fashion rather than a rapid fashion, which obviously we can apply to our own lives and see how we do not like rapid change also. And what happens when these needs aren't met, or if they are being met and they're suddenly not being met any longer, which I would call a loss of some kind in adult language? Well, I guess the baby becomes unhappy, unserene, and the baby will start crying. Maybe even throw a tantrum in time, trying to get back what it wanted, and that is its basic needs met, so the baby can be serene again, if you will. And finally, I'd throw in one last need that we adults especially like to focus in on in our lives to combat fear or achieve serenity, basically. And that is a certain amount of stimulation. And I'm kind of thinking these days that maybe quite a bit of the stimulation we crave, especially as adults, has to do with wanting to distract ourselves from some discomfort we have. It may not be severe pain, but discomfort. And so you might say that even a baby cannot always get its needs fully met. The temperature may not be ideal, or the baby might not be able to sleep exactly when it wants to. But in compensation for this, both for the baby and adults, when our needs are only partially met, then I suppose we tend to turn toward stimulation to distract us. And of course we might call that entertainment in adult terms, and shaking a rattle to a baby for the baby, or maybe making some soothing sounds by the mother or father, or playing some music while the baby is sleeping, or maybe even a light on in the room while the baby goes to sleep. At any rate, this being in my mind a kind of a adjunct to basic human needs, when those basic human needs aren't being fully met all the time, minute by minute, which of course is quite difficult in real life. Now next, I'd like to take a look briefly at what we humans do when we don't get our needs met, or we only get them partially met, or some of the time. I'd say we've all heard of the fight or flight mechanism, haven't we, to deal with fear or challenges in our lives. But why not take a look now with me at how we may expand this a bit, such that we may take fight or flight approaches to our fears. Not just people threats, but basic physiological need threats, not getting our needs met in those ways. And for instance, take flight. I'd say this is a very popular means that many of us use for a variety of reasons, such as, especially if we've tried to fight and fight and fight. Not just with our fists, but our minds and our efforts in every respect, and we keep coming up short. And keep coming up short. Keep failing. Well, I suppose you might call this learned helplessness in psychology terms, but at any rate, I suppose at a certain point we either give up or we try and flight in terms of escaping from the fear. And by escape, I mean some means of distracting our mind from the fear so we don't think about it. So, of course, this isn't rocket science to us, is it? Some of the most favorite ways of distracting ourselves. This, in the aid of flight from our fears, would be to dull our minds with drugs or alcohol, for starters. And then I suppose you could look into whether you're talking about legal drugs or illegal drugs, but both in the same idea here. And finally, that drugs or alcohol being kind of one and the same in that they're dulling our minds. So we can't really think clearly. And if you can't think clearly, or your awareness in general is cut down, then your awareness of your fears will be too, won't it? Which, of course, then is kind of a compromise solution, I'd call it, and many of us strive to get the best compromise possible, such that using alcohol too much can be not a good compromise solution because you may have a car accident and everything that follows. Or it may impact your marriage or relationships or your ability to work or stay out of jail or prison. So this approach to dulling your mind is probably not the greatest, is it? And use of illegal drugs could be problematic too, because they could be quite costly, and you could get diseases from the administering of them by intravenous means, or you could end up in jail or prison once again and get a criminal record and never get a good job again after you get out of prison. So again, not a good idea. Which then leaves something like psychic drugs. Drugs such as tranquilizers, basically. And these too, I maintain, dulling your mind, but often, first of all, they're legal, and second of all, typically covered by insurance these days. And hopefully with a better side effect profile in other ways too, like not resulting in car accidents as much, although this point can be questionable in my mind. And then, if we're not talking about dulling our mind, how about distracting it? I'd say probably the number one distractor in American life is TV, with figures these days ranging of around 5 hours a day average use of TV. And while we would call it typically entertainment after a hard day's work or frustrating day's work in general, well, if you take a look at that word entertainment, I would suspect what we're generally talking about after 1 hour's worth of TV a night especially is distraction. Distraction from our frustrations, our fears and our anger. And then, if we're not talking about TV, we're probably talking about social media overuse or working too much, typically called workaholism. And part and parcel of that, in my mind, being that we tend, especially in industrialized countries, to spend way too much time working because we're either being forced to pay high rent costs, or in other words, housing costs that are astronomical, or we're working very hard to get things we really don't need for our basic physiological needs, but somewhere along the line, people and institutions have told us that these are basic needs, and so we chase after them. And this, of course, being exasperated or exacerbated when we see our neighbors with certain objects and we don't have them. And even more a problem if we start to get shunned when we don't keep up. Even to the point where we may find ourselves in a lower social class, and the class we were once in rejects us. And I'd say two additional big-time distractors in certain societies that we don't think about that much is over-socializing and too much sexual activity, whereby these themselves can be distractors too. We say, oh, we're social animals, let's say, and it's good to be social, but all in moderation, people would have said way back 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And I would say too much of anything tends to serve a purpose more of distraction. Even overeating is a favorite, especially in our country. And whether this is more of a distraction or a dulling agent on our mind or a tranquilizer is to be debated, but this again also being a way to combat fears. So, of course, on the other hand, if we're not trying to distract ourselves or dull ourselves from our fears, what about distracting ourselves by giving us a big high, such as a cocaine high or a meth high? I suppose the problem with this is that it can't be maintained forever, and more of the drugs are required to get that same high, with many costs involved then. And furthermore, when you're high like that, I don't think you can think too straight, and then you're going to run into problems with making money and keeping apart from the law. So with all of these things considered as downsides, what about the other option that I brought up earlier, to fight instead of flight? Well, I'd say that that's another popular means that we tend to use in industrialized countries in particular, and maximally in America. And what better way to fight something, a fear, anything, than to make money to use to fight it with? Because money can buy you a lot of things, tools, other things that can be very useful at times. But of course, how much time and effort, pain and sweat you have to put into getting this pile of money is a good question. And how to balance this all out for an optimal life. So let's take a look at how money might be used to fight our fears and then achieve this kind of serenity I think we're all looking for. Well, I'd kind of break it down into two avenues. First, getting our basic needs met, and then on a consistent basis so that we're not experiencing many losses of these. And if we are experiencing losses, they're of a gradual and predictable nature. Because all of us human beings, to one extent or another, I know, do not like sudden losses. Of course, the proof of the pudding of that idea is how much distress we tend to have if we hear that so-and-so friend of ours or celebrity just dropped dead suddenly at work of a widowmaker heart attack, as opposed to dying of a gradual and predictable and more acceptable in many eyes process like cancer or heart disease, or even, if it came to it, Alzheimer's, a slow deterioration of your mind. Well, certainly, I suppose one of the biggest things money buys us, if we have enough of it, is good housing. Good housing to not only get our basic human needs met, but part of that being a low level of chaos, low level of crime, good schools for our children, and perhaps some status from it too, if that's important to us. But at any rate, housing being very important, and that it continues so to the day we die, such that when we talk about wanting good housing, we also want the best housing in terms of a possible nursing home house, don't we? You have to start thinking then in terms of a nursing home possibility as a house that we're shopping for and piling up money for, that may or may not come upon us suddenly, or we may or may not have a choice even in the matter. But at any rate, back in the mind of many people, I would say, is having enough money to garner good end-of-life care in a nursing home that is not 1-star or 2-star rated by agencies, and would be more of a torture chamber than anything. And then, of course, there's the issue of health care, which is probably the second largest expenditure of our Americans' pocketbooks. For how can you be happy, most people will say, if you're sick, especially with a chronic illness, or if, let's say, you have a loved one and they get sick and can't get proper care for health reasons either, and you see them suffering or perhaps dying prematurely, so to speak. Naturally, we desire good health care. And of course, this costs money. Good health care doesn't grow on trees, does it? And access is tied to how much money you have, as well as the luck of the draw as to who is booked up for weeks or months or years and who isn't, and what part of the country you live in. But at any rate, what kind of insurance you have being quite key to most people. And the better the insurance, the more money it costs per month. And we're talking, of course, insurance for your next house, your ultimate house, the possible nursing home, in terms of long care health insurance. And as I mentioned earlier, of course money dictates your housing and then where your children grow up. And that, of course, dictating then the kind of schooling they get, how much bullying they're subject to, and how much encouragement from fellow children they get to do various criminal activities, such as illegal drug use or shoplifting, or encouragement to join in and bully other children. all of these being heavily impacted by what kind of housing you provide your children. And of course, housing also impacting burglary rates and other crime rate factors like even murder or violent crime in other ways. Oh, and let's not forget that the degree of money one has can affect where one turns to for education, should one want education from higher sources like college, or providing the best grammar school education for your children. Many parents desiring to put children in private schools if they can afford it. And so to recap, I'd say that the fight approach to fears, and thus to encourage serenity in our lives, is to make a lot of money to garner these things I've just been talking about, which the absence of which might cause a lot of pain. And of course, if we see that pain on the future, we're going to be fearful that it could happen. But now I'd like to bring up a possible third approach. And it's an approach, I suppose you could say, used to be quite popular in America, but is dwindling, and that's the spiritual approach. But by spiritual, I kind of mean a cognitive approach. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. A mind approach. That we can manipulate our fears, lessen them through our mind. And not by controlling so much our outward circumstances or dulling our mind, which is the first two approaches I've talked of. So I suppose we're talking either through religious means, or mindfulness meditation, or through what you might call typical psychological therapy, or in today's terms perhaps cognitive behavioral therapy, where in all these cases I'd maintain we're trying to manipulate our mind to lessen our fears. And I'll go into this a bit, what I think on this. First of all, to look at the spiritual approach, I've seen it mentioned before that of the 4,000 some religions in the world today, that almost all of them have as a key component adherence to the belief that there's an afterlife, that basically will never die. And so this, of course, is a big way of combating fear, isn't it? And pain. Because we can count on something, a bliss to follow. And personally, I see no way of proving or disproving an afterlife. Secondly, every few years, you might see in Time magazine, for instance, or discussed in general terms everywhere, that going to church is good for your health. I'd say for a number of reasons, but some would argue particularly because of the social aspects. Whereas some of the other approaches I've talked of earlier today don't particularly involve doing anything with people. And of course, being social has many benefits. So articles have said that people who go to church tend to live longer and possibly be happier. At any rate, This being a powerful means, then, I would say, of cognitively manipulating our fears to lessen them. And I'd like to backtrack for a second and discuss for just a second why I personally think that manipulating our fears is probably the best way to go in life. Long-term strategy for serenity. And that is because I believe the human brain is more malleable than any other life form. What I mean by that is we're less driven totally by instincts, whereas many animals are just pre-programmed and totally instinctual. Whereas a human, though, if it doesn't get its basic needs met, then this person, this life, can intervene with our minds to cope with the environment that's less than pleasing, less than optimal. And I'll go into this just a second. For consider two things that animals, other than humans, would find intolerable if they couldn't get met. And that is staying alive and procreating, having sex. For consider the human being. That who hasn't heard of the idea of a mother giving up their life to save their child? Well, I would say that's kind of anti-instinctual, and no other animal life form would do this except a human, and the only reason we can is because we're not so dictated totally by our instincts, but we can manipulate things with our mind. We can tell ourselves things that will cause us actually to go against our instinctual nature to survival. And then secondly, mankind is able to adapt to not procreating if necessary, or not fulfilling its sexual urges in general. For what else would you do if you go to prison, let's say, and you don't indulge yourself in some manner there? Suddenly you're going to have to use your mind, your cognitions, to work against your instincts. Now some other type of life form, animal, whatever, wouldn't be able to do this. And of course, what about widowed people, particularly women, many not marrying again after loss of a spouse? Well, somehow, cognitively, they come to accept this. And finally, going back again to dealing with death, I'd say that as we get older, we tend to accept death more as inevitable. And while if we were only dealing on an instinctual basis, that might never be the case, that the situation would change for us. But because we are partially driven by our mind, that in time in our lives we tend to get more control over our instincts to survive, such that by the time we may reach 100, we're ready to let life slip by and cognitively say, we had a good run and I really enjoyed it. Now I suppose this is where I see some difficulties cropping up in using our mind to settle for less than what we might like physiologically to get our basic needs met, even for survival or for procreation or pleasures from that. First of all, what about feeling shame if we don't get our needs met? I think, for instance, of how some people might be able to handle losing mobility in life, such that they might have to use a cane or a wheelchair someday. They might be able to handle it fairly well, except for concern over what other people say of their condition. Either ridicule, you might say, I don't want to be considered an old fogey, or here's a biggie, I don't want people to say about me that I didn't take care of my health, that I was a fool for not looking ahead, or not working hard enough to get insurance, good insurance, to get good medical care or the best possible, to again forestall some things like various crippled conditions that people might try to shame us for. So not only do we worry then about possible feelings of pain in time, but in my opinion it can be 10 times more painful than the physiological pain to be worried about what other people say about our being in pain. And isn't that interesting? Such that if only we could minimize the shame we typically tend to feel over a lack of control in our lives that causes some of the pain we may encounter, then wouldn't that be wonderful? It's bad enough to feel pain, let alone the pain of feeling shame about it. Now, secondly, I would say that many of us human beings tend to catastrophize certain things in life. For instance, depending on what religious faith you were brought up in, if any, we might catastrophize possible punishment after death. And this being no small matter, no small concern for many people. And the means we go to try and arrive at a solution to this can be quite complex and costly in many ways. But at any rate, I kind of see catastrophizing of pain in two ways. Either pain after death, punishment especially, or not knowing just what might happen. Or secondly, catastrophizing pain in the here and now while we're still alive, because in the back of our minds we think this pain will go on forever and ever and ever. Because I think we kind of have a tendency as human beings to think we're never going to die. Or that's such a desirable wish in our minds that we kind of operate off this principle. And then, of course, become highly surprised when we go to the doctor one day and they tell us we have cancer, or we have diabetes, or heart disease, or even the possibility of getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. That at any rate, until that diagnosis hit us, we kind of thought in the back of our mind we'd live forever. Somehow, some way, that we'd make it happen. Or that we feel too good for things not to be suddenly ending. But then here's the problem with this kind of mentality of ours, I think. That then, if we think we're going to live forever in the back of our mind, then any pain we happen to be feeling or worry might happen to us and be chronic later on would go on forever, wouldn't it? And then who can stomach that possibility? Let's say if you had a stroke and you're laid up in bed and you can't get out of bed ever again, and you can't speak, write, anything almost. Well, if you think in the back of your mind you're going to live forever, that's a pretty horrifying thing then, isn't it? But that's catastrophizing, I maintain, because if we had the proper perspective, all of us did, we'd tell ourselves that life is limited, and that no matter what happens to us, what pain suddenly happens or is chronic, that there's a limitation on it. You might call it a statute of limitations on pain. Or, as I like to look at it, that somehow the universe or a deity or whatever, higher power, designed things so that we have an expiration date. So, in a merciful sort of sense, life being merciful, that at least pain won't last forever, especially if you find yourself in a special, unusual fix and you come down with something chronic that will never go away. I'd say then it can be quite comforting to realize we're going to die someday, and to quit playing games with ourselves that would never happen. Because to accept our limitation that we're going to die can be quite comforting, I would maintain, in an odd sort of way, because it gives us a guarantee that any suffering we come at in the future or we're presently experiencing will not in fact be torturous in the sense of lasting forever. And isn't that then what we most worry about if a person is a Christian and is worried about possible punishment in the Christian's hell? That one of the worst things about it is that it would last forever, not just be painful. So, of course, if we're catastrophizing pain in this life as horrible because we think it's going to go forever, well, that's a problem that we should be trying to slowly address cognitively, mentally. Because who can't tolerate pain to some extent if they know that there's going to be relief down the road? That makes it much more tolerable in my book. And then there's one last thing I'd like to take a look at that I've personally been working through in my life in the past year or two. And that is, what is the source of the pain? For consider, if we were a farmer, we had a barn and a lightning bolt hit it and it burned to the ground, we would feel emotional pain, wouldn't we? But let's say also we suffered losses from a hurricane, losses to our property or to a loved one even. Again, we would feel emotional pain. But what about losses accruing from something involving a person? Let's say the loss that causes emotional pain from a sudden divorce or a very messy divorce. Or what about losses caused by injuries from a crime, a violent crime? Or losses caused by trauma from what you might refer to in some circles as child abuse? Well, why do we regard pain from child abuse, so to speak, much more difficult to work through than pain from a lightning bolt or a tornado, or let's say even cancer, or a car accident? There's a big question here. And I think part of it has to do with philosophy's topics of free will versus determinism, but also because in certain societies, especially ours, I maintain that we have an attitude we should fight back. If we incur some kind of pain, some loss especially, as caused by a person and not an object or act of nature. For when was the last time someone told you to fight back against a lightning bolt or tornado if you had losses and ensuing pain from that? But if we're growing up as children and we get pained emotions from bullying and we don't quote-unquote fight back, that's where the problem begins. I think we'd be called sissies all too often, or running away, and cowards, etc., etc. And sometimes the problem is that we can't fight back against other people without getting in a lot of trouble, without it not being worthwhile in general. For who hasn't heard the phrase, you can't fight City Hall? Or the story from the Bible of David versus Goliath, where in that story, that scenario, it worked out best for David to take on the big bully, so to speak. But most of the time, David might have found himself pulverized. In the same way that if you take on City Hall, as the phrase goes, you might additionally find yourself pulverized with a lawsuit, or suddenly find yourself in prison or jail. So this whole business of fighting back against humans versus a natural cause of pain is a very big issue, I would maintain. Especially if you grew up being bullied and were urged to fight back, and you didn't know what to do because maybe you were outnumbered, and the costs of fighting back might not have been in your best interest, but other people were telling you you should. Now, of course, there is another source of emotional pain in most all of us, I'd say, at least in the back of our minds, and that's the pain of worry about, for lack of a better word, gradual loss of awareness, where you might talk of Alzheimer's or dementia in general. And I'm not really going to delve into this at present because this is a big issue in and of itself. But at any rate, I do recognize that is a big issue that we all tend to fear to some degree of consciousness, and has to be reconciled with somehow. And of course, issues with euthanasia then too. And of course, our country differing considerably than European countries, especially the Netherlands, on this whole topic. But at any rate, I'd like to recap on this discussion and talk of how I just mentioned issues of first, not feeling shame over feeling pain, and secondly, not feeling a sense of catastrophe over pain and loss of life in general, that our pain will be limited. And third, that we would best, I say, come to grips as best we can with why so many of us fear and want to fight back against pain from people causes versus natural causes, or even objects like a car wreck. If we can get a handle on these three topics, I'd say we're getting somewhere big time in life. And last but not least, I'd like to take a look at the topic of losses. In particular, when you hear the phrase, how we tend to want to keep up with the Joneses. And also issues of claims of unfairness, inequity of income. And while I would maintain there is great inequity of income and wealth, particularly in America, that I think we're basically looking up the wrong tree to focus on that, when what we should probably focus on mostly is getting our needs met and how to cope with them if they're not getting met fully or partially, as I've talked of here today. Because really, some people have said that the sweet spot for income level is $75,000 a year per person. That after that, you're pretty well getting most of your basic needs met on a consistent basis here on out. And while you can argue this, of course, it's quite complex. The point being that who needs the wealth of Croesus, so to speak? Who needs to have the wealth of Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or some others? What extra good does that do? And in fact, how much more headache does that possibly bring us in simply administering those funds and making sure they don't suddenly get stolen, so to speak? But at any rate, the problem is, I believe, so often that we are given to comparing ourselves. And here's what I mean. That, let's say we buy a house and we're very happy with it, very proud. But one day we go on a Sunday drive and happen to drive into a neighborhood where the houses are valued at 5 times what ours is. Well, wouldn't you think then suddenly that we go back home for dinner and say, boy, this place is a dump? Or we say, boy, this place is a cracker box compared to what I just saw. So the phrase keeping up with the Jones is, in my mind, being we want to be on the same playing field, or we suddenly start saying things to ourselves that devalue what once gave us a lot of pleasure. Or you might say we're playing comparison games. Or let's say you just bought your first car and it's a Chevy. Or let's say even you have a Mercedes or Lexus. But then one day you come to a stop sign or stoplight, and in front of you is a Lamborghini or a Rolls Royce, if it's in good running condition. At any rate, suddenly we feel perhaps that our Mercedes or Lexus is a tin can. It's worthless. And again, comparing ourselves. So if only we could work through this thing cognitively again, mentally, such that we're not beating ourselves up all the time and incurring what I call imaginary losses, not real losses at all. We haven't lost our property, our car, our house. We've just lost our image of what they meant to us. So if we can get past this, boy, again, a feather in our cap. Of course, this is easier said than done, because we all know how much we love television and the movies. And of course, stores, having all number of goods out there on the shelves or online, way more than we could possibly afford or spend time even ordering, let alone pay for and unpackage and find a place to put them. But at any rate, the point being that we're so inundated by our media and the store shelves, both brick and mortar and online, that we're constantly pummeled with reminders that there's more out there than what we have in our personal control or what we own in general. So we're constantly playing a comparison game, I would say. And in not helping any, I'd say that if we don't have certain things, some who have more will probably reject us. Of course, this even goes for our clothing, whereby as teenagers, if we don't have those Calvin Klein jeans, we'll be unfavorably compared to by those who do and get rejected all too often. This being another factor then, that we not only devalue then what we once enjoyed, but we can get rejected for what we have too, even if we do enjoy the things we have. So kind of a double whammy here. At any rate, this is the longest podcast I've ever done, but I'd like to just recap very quickly that I think at present I kind of see 3 ways we can approach fear. And some are better than others in the long term, and some are better than others to achieve cost-wise, emotionally, etc. in the short term. We can fight, we can flight, or we can process our fears cognitively, either through spiritual means or through logical means, you might say, whereby we do things like not engaging in catastrophizing and feeling shame. So I've thrown a lot out here in this hour-long episode, but I hope it gives an overview of the topic in a way that's helpful. It's something I've thought about much of the time for years now. And I share what I've come to today at this point with you. Of course, knowing I don't have all the answers, but at any rate, I put this out for consideration. Wish you a good day.